Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. The Battle of Drowndaisy Ford. The Battle of Drowndaisy Ford was fought in the year 19 between the dwarves and the halflings on the upper reaches of the Silver Stream. Female halflings are traditionally named after flowers, and the story goes that there was a halfling maiden who went by the name of Daisy. She was collecting flowers in the woods by the Silver Stream and, running excitedly from flower to flower, found herself by a lily-fringed pool at the river's edge. Like most halflings, Daisy was very nervous of larger bodies of water, but as she started to back away, she caught sight of her reflection. Now, in common with many female hominids, Daisy was very interested in her appearance, and the opportunity to look at this image of herself overcame her apprehension. Staring into the waters, the light flickering on the surface fascinated her, until, leaning further and further forward, she overbalanced and fell into the pool. Because halflings are scared of any body of water large enough to swim in, they do not learn to swim, and Daisy's body was therefore subsequently discovered floating face down at the water's edge. And that, the halflings will tell you, not only explains how Drowndaisy Ford came to be so named, but also provides a practical demonstration of why water is dangerous and best avoided. The dwarvish force that marched to Drowndaisy Ford with the intention of forcing a crossing and invading the halfling lands was around 350 strong. It was led by Hogni and his two eldest sons, Hognar and Haldan. When going to war, those dwarves who can afford or can make armour will typically fight with spear and shield, while those who cannot usually seek to avoid hand-to-hand combat, instead attacking the enemy from a distance with crossbows. The army of Hogni was no exception, split broadly equally between these types of troops. Halflings are less warlike than dwarves. Very few halflings possess armour. The majority of halflings will fight from a distance with slings or bows, using cover and mobility to their advantage and seeking to wear down the enemy. Less timorous halflings may equip themselves with spears and sometimes shields so that they can engage the enemy hand to hand, but the truth is that unless they are fighting other halflings, their small size and lack of armour make them rather ineffective in this role. At the Battle of Drowndaisy Ford, there were approximately 100 halflings armed with spears and shields, and approximately 250 armed with either slings or bows. The halfling-held bank of the Silver Stream had many patches of dense woodland, as the halflings had not cleared the land by the river. After all, it is dangerous to get too close to the water. The halflings had heard that the dwarves were coming, and deployed their archers and slingers in the cover of the woods, from where they could loose projectiles at anyone crossing the ford. The archers were on the left and the slingers on the right. The spear-armed halflings were positioned further back, in the centre, concealed by the trees. The dwarves approached the ford with the spear dwarves in the centre and crossbows on each flank. Hogni's first move was to send the crossbow-armed dwarves on his right forward, into a position where the longer range of their crossbows enabled them to engage the halfling archers without the archers being able to respond in kind. The dwarvish marksmen proved to be accurate, and casualties started to mount among the halfling archers, who responded by charging out of the trees and down to the riverbank. As the halflings moved forward, their ranks were further thinned by flying crossbow bolts. However, this move did bring the dwarvish marksmen within range of the halfling archers, and a ferocious exchange of missiles ensued, in which both sides took heavy casualties. Meanwhile, the crossbow-armed dwarves on Hogni's left flank moved forward to engage the halfling slingers. Even as they did so, the last of the halfling archers fell or fled, and Hogni rejoiced that the battle was going his way. But slings are not outranged by crossbows, and a sling can put a large number of projectiles downrange very quickly. As the dwarves on the left moved forward, they were greeted by a veritable hailstorm of lead slingshot. Large numbers of them were killed or crippled, and the remainder ran. As his left flank evaporated, so did Hogni's good spirits. He had told his dwarves that the halflings were not fighters, and it would be easy to defeat them. He decided that he needed to force the issue now, before his dwarves lost courage. He urged his spear dwarves forward, up to the ford. The ford was narrow, and the dwarves had to form into column to cross it. As the first dwarves stepped into the river, they too were pelted with a storm of lead. The leading dwarves fell, but the remaining dwarves pushed forward into the middle of the river. The halfling slingers redoubled their efforts, and more dwarves fell. Still the dwarves came on, and as the leading dwarves reached the far bank, lead ceased to rain upon them. The halfling slingers had run out of slingshot. At this point, the halfling spearmen charged out of the forest, down to the river and into the dwarves who were now climbing the river bank. And with a cry, the slingers ran forward behind them. The halflings were fighting for their families and homes, and knew that this was the last ditch. The fighting on the riverbank was fierce. Many of the halflings fell, but the dwarves were unable to gain the bank. The remaining crossbow dwarves moved forward on the right, taking pot shots at the halflings as opportunities arose. But still the halflings held firm, and they were also inflicting casualties on the spear dwarves. Hogni reviewed the situation. He was now outnumbered 2-1, and although his troops were better armoured and equipped, he could not effectively bring them into action because of the restricted dimensions of the ford. He reluctantly turned to Halfdan and told him to sound his horn, to sound the retreat. And so the dwarves withdrew, leaving the field to the victorious halflings. And so ended the Battle of Drowndaisy Ford.